With the Corsair PC Build Kit, you've got everything you need to put together your own system, with parts guaranteed to work together. This takes the guesswork out of picking parts, while still giving you all the fun of building it yourself. Once your Corsair PC Build Kit arrives, you'll first want to take the components out and go through the provided checklist to verify that you've received everything for your build. Now, prep a space for you to build your system in. We recommend clearing a large desk or table and making sure that you keep all your tools and components within reach. And with that, we're ready to get this build started. Once you've got all the parts and tools ready to go, it's time to take out the case. The case will house all of the components for the build, and to make the process as smooth as possible, we're going to remove all the panels and filters. We'll put them back on near the end of the build, but for now we'll just set them aside. We'll also look for the accessories box in the hard drive cage, which will include some zip ties, straps, and screws for mounting things. The computer case has been prepped, and we're now ready to take a look at our first component that'll go in our new build. The motherboard is a vital part of any computer and connects all of your components together. When unpacking the motherboard, be careful not to touch any exposed pins. Before installing the motherboard into the case, it's a good idea to install smaller components directly onto the motherboard first. Set the motherboard onto its box, which comes in handy as an install platform to protect the underside. With the motherboard ready, we're going to unpack the CPU, M.2 SSD, and memory for our build. First, install the CPU. Simply lift the latch, align the CPU with the socket, gently place it into the socket, then secure it into place. Now, find an open M.2 slot. Generally, we'll want to use the slot that's closest to the CPU for our storage. Remove any M.2 covers that may be present. Move the standoff to the correct position, if necessary, then drop the M.2 SSD into the slot and rest it on the standoff. Now secure the SSD into place. Next up is memory. Memory works best in matching pairs, and for this build, we've got one pair of modules. If your motherboard has 4 slots, simply read the silkscreen text next to the memory slots to find out which slots should be used. Now, grab the memory modules and install them one at a time. First, unlatch the memory slots. Then, align the notch on the memory module with the notch in the slot on the motherboard, and gently insert each module one at a time until they click into place. So now it's time to install the motherboard into the case. First, insert the I/O shield for your motherboard into the cutout at the back of the case. Make sure to orient it so that it'll line up with the ports on the back of your motherboard once it's installed. Now we'll gently place the motherboard onto the standoffs. With this case, we've got a center aligning pin that goes through one of the holes in the motherboard. With the motherboard resting on the standoffs, we'll grab our motherboard screws that were included with the case and secure the motherboard into place. And now we've got our motherboard installed into our case and we're ready for the next part of the build. With the motherboard already prepped and installed in the case, it's time to get things ready for our CPU cooler. For this build, we're going to use an all-in-one CPU liquid cooler, so we're going to prep the CPU socket with our cooler's backplate and secure that in place with the appropriate standoffs for our CPU socket. Now we can prep the cooler itself and install 2 RGB fans. Make sure that you've got the fans installed so that air will flow through the cooler's radiator so that hot air can be properly exhausted once it's installed in the case. We're now going to install the cooler's radiator into the top of the case. This way the fans on the radiator will pull cooler air in and quickly exhaust warm air through the top. Now install the pump head. Aligning the pre-installed CPU mounting bracket onto the pump head with the standoffs that we installed earlier onto the backplate. Secure the pump head into place by screwing the thumb screws onto the standoffs a few turns at a time in a crisscross pattern to ensure even pressure is applied. Finally, let's take a look at our fan configuration. For this build, we'll remove the pre-installed front panel and rear exhaust fans in our case, and install 3 RGB fans as intakes in the front, with the 4th RGB fan serving as our exhaust. With our cooler installation and fan configuration complete, it's time to start plugging in the cables for the case I/O, fans, and CPU cooler. Once we've got our cooler installed and our case fans in place, it's time to start connecting cables to our motherboard. First, connect any cables for the case's front I/O panel such as USB 3.0, USB Type-C, power and reset switches, and audio. Now install any lighting or fan controllers that'll drive your internal RGB devices such as your fans. For builds using a Lightning node core, make sure to plug the RGB cables from the fans in sequential order. Now connect the USB 2.0 cable for any internal devices that you're including in your build. Connect the cable harness to the pump head on your all-in-one cooler, then connect your radiator fans to the fan splitter. When installing a CPU liquid cooler, connect the TAC cable to an AIO pump header if your motherboard has it. Now plug in the rest of your case fans into any available fan headers across your motherboard. While working with all these cables, it's a good idea to group similar devices together so that they all run to the same general area behind your motherboard, if possible. We recommend loosely securing them in place while you wrap up your build. Then go back and tie them down once you've got everything installed. With our motherboard cables started, we can take out our power supply. Find the 8-pin EPS power cable and run that to the EPS header on your motherboard. If you have a radiator installed in the top of your case, you may need to loosen some screws and slide the radiator out of the way. Find the 24-pin ATX power cable and run that to the 24-pin ATX header. Grab the PCI Express power cable and run that to roughly where your graphics card will be. It's also a good idea to make sure that you have a SATA power cable that's within reach so that you can plug in your internal accessories. When building with the modular power supply, now would be the time to connect the power supply side of the cables that we've run. Slide the power supply into the PSU chamber at the bottom of the case, making sure that the fan is facing down so that it can pull cool, filtered air through the bottom cutout. Secure the power supply into place with the provided screws. Now connect any internal SATA devices to the SATA power cable that we set aside. Once everything is plugged in, hide the excess cables in the PSU chamber. Now it's time to install the build's PCI Express cards. First, remove the PCI slot covers from the back of your case. For the graphics card, you'll want to remove the covers for the PCI Express slots closest to the processor, as that's generally going to be the slot with the most bandwidth. Make sure to remove any other PCI slot covers so that you can install an accessory like a Wi-Fi card. Make sure to set aside the thumb screws. You'll be needing them to secure the graphics card and other accessories in place. When installing PCI Express devices, it's a good idea to start with the smallest device first. In this case, we're going to be installing our Wi-Fi card first, so that's out of the way. We'll also make sure to plug in the USB cable that we connected earlier to our motherboard. Moving on to the graphics card, make sure that the latch securing the slot is open, then gently insert the card into the slot. Now secure everything with the thumb screws that we set aside. Now connect the graphics card to power. At this point, you can reinstall your case's dust filters and side panels, as well as prepare a space for powering on your system for the first time. Now that we've got everything assembled and connected in our build, it's time for a power on test. Grab the power cable that came with your power supply and connect one end to the PSU and the other end to a wall outlet. Flip the switch on the power supply to the on position. Make sure you've also connected your monitor and peripherals while you're at it. Now press the power button at the front of your system. Your new PC will now power on and boot into the Windows first time startup experience. Follow the prompts and make sure to enter the Windows activation key once you get asked for it. Once you've wrapped up the initial Windows setup, you'll want to make sure to let your system sit for a minute to grab any Windows and driver updates. Then you can start installing all your favorite applications and games. And that's it. Corsair PC build kits take the guesswork out of picking components for a build, while still giving you the full DIY experience of assembling it yourself. Thanks for watching.